Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Randall Alcorn. He is a private lands biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources and an NRCS Area Liaison. Hi, Randall. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hey, it's great to be here. I appreciate you inviting me onto your podcast to talk.
And I asked you to chat with us today to help us learn about the different ways that the NRCS can help us create pollinator and wildlife habitat on our properties. And I want to take a quick second just to let all of our listeners know that you'll probably hear us using the acronym NRCS quite a bit today. NRCS stands for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but that's such a mouthful that nobody says the full name. Everybody just uses the abbreviation NRCS. But before we start talking about the NRCS specifically and some of the programs that they have, Randall, let's just take a couple of minutes and tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do.
All righty. As you stated, I am a private lands biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've been with the department for about 11 years, it'll be 11 years in October. Being with the department as an agency, our private land staff, what we offer is we're here to help people with technical guidance on how they can manage their property for specific wildlife or just wildlife in general. We offer field visits, phone technical guidance. We offer habitat how-tos. If you're interested in doing a specific practice, we can go over that with you and then offer information as well to help guide you. But that's just some of the services that we offer on the private land side.
And is that specific to just what you do through the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, or is that also NRCS related?
That is the specific to the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife side. On the NRCS side, it's kind of the same role. I'm a liaison, so I act as kind of the go-between for NRCS and Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. The state is divided up into three areas, Area 1, 2, and 3. I am in Area 3, which is the eastern part of the state. In the eastern part of the state, I have 3 other private lands biologists that I supervise that we do the same thing as far as making field visits and offer technical guidance to landowners. And then if the landowner is interested in participating in some of the NRCS equip cost share programs, we can help guide that landowner into how they apply and how they get the cost share to help implement some of these conservation practices.
And are most states set up so that's the same way you've got these liaison positions, or are they more often kind of set up by themselves, or is it a mixture?
It's a little bit of a mixture. Kentucky is kind of unique in that the NRCS here in Kentucky works really close handed with Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife to help implement their wildlife conservation programs. Other states vary. It may be all NRCS employees that handle those. They may get guidance from other fish and wildlife agencies in those states, but Kentucky's kind of unique in how we operate, where NRCS has a pretty close partnership with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife.
So I guess we should start at the very beginning. What does the NRCS do, and what is it?
Yeah, the NRCS, as you stated, is a Natural Resource Conservation Service. They used to be the Soil Conservation Service. They kind of got established after the Dust Bowl. When the Dust Bowl came through, it was pretty evident that we needed to do something about conservation, soil erosion, those types of things. So the SCS was established, which later turned into the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But generally what they do is their main goal is to help farmers and ranchers implement conservation practices voluntarily on their property through cost share assistance is their main goal.
Okay. Our audience is primarily in the Eastern US, but I know we've got listeners all over the country as well. And some of our listeners, based on what they've told me, they have small urban yards. Others own hundreds of acres, and many others are just somewhere in between there. So we have lots and lots of diversity and variety when it comes to our properties in terms of locations, because obviously different states and different parts of the states are going to be very different when it comes to habitat or climate or just any number of things like that. I mean, Kentucky, Tennessee alone, just those two states, we go from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River. So we've got a lot of variety within the state, lots of variety in sizes and even land use, because I mean, some of our listeners have working farms and they're managing part of that property for pollinators and wildlife. Others have land, but it's not a working farm. And even some of our people who don't have as much land, who have what we would consider more of a typical yard, those aren't the same. Some have mostly pollinator habitat with very little traditional yard, and others have that reversed. So, like I said, there isn't a one size fits all listener here at all. We've got a lot of diversity. And you mentioned that NRCS was created really looking at farmers. And I know for a long time, especially starting out, I thought of NRCS as really an organization that only worked with farmers. But I've learned that that isn't always the case. So let's just talk about that a little bit. Can anyone participate in the NRCS programs?
Yes, it's that general statement of farmers and ranchers, that's kind of an overview of what their focus is, but really anybody can apply depending on what kind of conservation you want to do. That's why there's such an array of practices out there, because like I said, it's not a one size fits all. There's loads of practices that might apply to your property versus somebody else's property. And that's why there's so much diversity in those practices, because you might have one set of goals and your neighbor might have another set of goals. But overall, you look at a landscape overall, and you're trying to make everything kind of work together. And that's generally what you do when you might have somebody that's a full-time farmer, but yet they like to watch wildlife, or might have an active beehive and want to promote more pollinators. And you can absolutely do that. You can merge wildlife and farming together. I mean, it's just because you're farming does not mean you have to exclude wildlife. And there's practices out there that can help you do that. Whether it's doing exclusion fences, there's cost share to help through that, doing buffers on your fields, just planting pollinator habitat altogether. And the general sense, when you say farm, you're thinking, somebody that's actively cropping or has livestock, but farm is kind of a general term for, the property that somebody owns. And NRCS is here to, help landowners in any way possible, whether it's the backyard or if it's the 100-acre farm. There's something that can help those individuals.
So are there any restrictions as to, like, do you need a certain amount of land or anything like that? And I'm guessing a lot of this depends on what specific program or practice we're looking at. But just kind of big picture, is there something for everybody?
Yeah, in a sense. So there used to be a restriction where you had to own at least 10 acres or more in order to qualify for some of these programs. That is no longer the case.
Okay.
So it really just depends on what you're wanting to do. Now, if we're talking about doing like 100-foot by 50-foot pollinator buffer in the backyard, let me back up a little bit. The conservation practices, you get a plan, and then you have to go through a ranking system based on what you're wanting to implement on your property. So in cases like that, the minimum here in Kentucky to do a pollinator is a half acre. So if you're just talking about doing like a small scale 100-foot by 50-foot pollinator, technical guidance can be provided to help you establish that. Resources can be provided to help you get that implemented. But as far as the cost share, just for something like that example, it would not be eligible for that just because you have to have that half acre. But other things, there's practices that NRCS provides, like the seasonal high tunnels. A lot of our urban customers has season high tunnels, which extends their growing period for their gardens. So people are eligible for those. But everything else is just kind of, it's based on, what your operation is doing, and kind of what your goals are for the property.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's good to know that they've removed that 10-acre limitation, because that was the last I had heard,
Yeah.
was that you had to have at least 10 acres. So
Yeah, and that's that still kind of floats around a little bit. The word hasn't got out quite as much, but I want to say it's been about 5 or 6 years ago that was lifted.
good to know. And maybe that information will help some of our listeners too, who may have been thinking, well, I've got 9 acres or 5 acres. And those are just under. That can be so frustrating when you just barely miss it.
Yeah. And, I would just encourage people that if you want to know information, I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask. I know it kind of hurts to get turned down on stuff, but, it doesn't cost anything to ask. And, if you've got questions, go visit your local offices and ask those questions and just see what happens. Go through the process a little bit and just see what happens.
That's very good advice. Can you tell us about some of the different programs that are available, especially ones that are available at kind of those larger scales? So maybe not necessarily Kentucky specific, which, I mean, of course, living in Kentucky, I'm interested in those, but also looking at some of those broader ones that some of our listeners that are in other states might be interested in finding out more and talking to their NRCS agents about.
So you have the EQIP program as kind of the overall program, and then there's sub-fund pools that come off of those. Kentucky has quite a few, and other states are going to have different fund pools that relate to, their habitat or what they're, well, just for example, out in West Kentucky, that's a little bit more crop focused, as opposed to Eastern Kentucky, it's more forest land focused. So there's funds pools over in Eastern Kentucky that relate more to forest land operations. And then in Western Kentucky, you got more fund pools that are set up to help people that are cropping more out there. And that's going to be kind of the general thing over other states as well. You'll have the general EQIP umbrella, so to speak, that most every state's going to have those practices, but then you're going to have these sub-fund pools that come off of those that might focus in a specific area of the state, depending on if there's like a resource that needs to be protected there. So you're going to have different areas that might apply to certain situations in different states. But as far as the general EQIP, that one's set up more for the farmer as far as helping with fencing, water facilities, pasture renovation, things of that nature. Invasive species control is under that one. Here in Kentucky, we got a big problem with bush honeysuckle, especially kind of in the central part of the state. Other states are going to have their own invasive species that are kind of taking over. So there's programs that help with those.
Nice.
And then again, like I said, it just depends on kind of the state geographic location on what other fund pools might focus specifically in those areas.
Okay. But so like one that I hear talked about a lot are funds for creating pollinator plantings and pollinator habitats. That's one that's pretty widespread, is it not?
Right. Yeah. Here in Kentucky, it's under the wildlife fund pool, as well as we got another one. It's called the Southeast Early Successional Habitat Program, which it's offered underneath that as well. It can also be part of the high tunnel. You have your high tunnel there to extend your garden, and then out front you might have your half-acre pollinator, so that your pollinating insects don't have far to go to find that pollinator habitat they need to help with your vegetables. But yeah, the pollinator is that's a big thing right now as far as a nation keeping the pollinators around. That's always been in decline. So getting that good pollinator habitat on the ground is a major focus for NRCS as well as other wildlife state agencies across the country. So yeah, there is available cost share to help landowners with establishing those pollinators. Like I said, here in Kentucky, it's a half-acre minimum. Now that may be different in other states. It just kind of what those states want to implement. And then there's other programs too. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, that's more of a Farm Service Agency program, but they also want to implement practices that help pollinator, and that's along crop borders or along water bodies put those buffers in place. So yeah, pollinators is a big key part of some of the stuff the NRCS wants to do.
Yes. And so there's cost shares available for that. I'm assuming from some of the other things that you were saying earlier that there's also technical advice available.
Right. So landowners, if you're interested in doing stuff for cost share through NRCS, you have to get what's called a farm number first, and that could be done at the Farm Servicing Agency. They can help set up a farm number. Then once you get that farm number, you can apply for the NRCS programs. So once you get all that taken care of, then a planning visit can be made to where your goals are considered during that planning process. So the steps would be that, let's say a landowner wants to do a 1 acre pollinator field, then that plan is written and that application is ranked. For the wildlife fund pool, it would be across the state. You're ranked with other applications. So what goes into the ranking is, the practice you're implementing, where it falls in the state of Kentucky, for example. If you fall in some of the old barren remnant areas, it's going to rank a little bit higher as opposed to somebody that's not in that area. But things like that are considered. So once you get that ranking score, then is determined by our state office, depending on how much money is in the EQIP fund pool given that year from the federal government. They set that ranking cutoff score. So if you are at that score or above, at that point you will get awarded a cost share contract, and then you can implement that contract based on the guidance given by myself or any other biologist or some of the NRCS staff. Now, if you're a landowner that's just want some technical advice, maybe you don't want to go through the cost share programs, that technical advice can also be provided from NRCS staff or Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife staff as well on the steps you need to take in order to make sure that pollinator planting is going to be successful. So yes, there is plenty of folks around, especially here in the state of Kentucky, that can offer some advice on how to establish a good pollinator habitat.
And you were talking about you were calling them funding pools, but you mentioned early successional habitat. That's one that I'm also really interested in. I think that a lot more people need to be interested in because we know that that's really one of the most rapidly declining habitat types out there. And there's so many different animals and insects and everything else that really rely on that habitat.
Yeah. So that one was, we established that back in 2013. And the goal was to, get some more early successional habitat or just do more habitat management for wildlife specific, with a main focus on ruffed grouse, because the ruffed grouse is in decline. And studies have shown that if the habitat is there, that they stand a better chance of building populations. So that fund pool is established, and we've been doing, forest stand improvement practices, invasive species work, creating patch clear cuts in order to create some more early successional habitat and get more herbaceous growth, more soft mass producing species on forest floors, as well as try to generate more oak and hickory development. Here in Eastern Kentucky, and I'm sure it's, in the Virginias and other states, that we have a big problem with maple encroachment, especially in our oak hickory forest. And that's just over years of logging is what that is. It's high grade logging that has taken the best trees out, and then you leave the less desirable trees, and then they tend to take over your stands. And it's hard to get that oak hickory component back, especially that fire is not as introduced as it was in the earlier years, the early 1900s and things. With the way technology is, which is, it's not a bad thing that, if a fire gets out, we generally get to it pretty good here in Kentucky. Whereas in the older days, a fire got out, it would, burn for a little bit, and it would keep that maple beech understory at bay. And the oaks can tolerate the fire to an extent, and that's what generally keeps them coming back year after year. So without that presence of fire, we got to look at other ways to maybe control or improve our forest, and a lot of that's through forest stand improvement practices, which that's what the Southeast Early Successional Habitat Fund Pool is about. And this primarily just focuses on the eastern Kentucky counties here in Kentucky.
Okay, so that's one that's more of a regional program.
Correct. Yeah. If somebody's interested in doing that here in Kentucky, and you fall, it's pretty much like I said, that it's 36 counties in the eastern along the eastern Kentucky, pretty much all forested areas. Yeah, if you're interested in maybe trying to apply for that fund pool, you will not be competing against the other counties of the state. So you're just competing in those 36 counties is the way that one will work.
So it really is focused just on the grouse and not necessarily on, say, quail or any of the other species that might be found further west, but are also declining.
Yeah, I mean, there is potential to, for example, do some quail management with like edge feathering and things that are within those counties. But we also have some of those practices in our wildlife fund pool that can go across the state as well. We can do clear cuts and we can do edge feathering, shrub plantings, things like that are also in the wildlife fund pool that can be, geared more towards area where quail are more populated.
And you mentioned invasive species a couple of times and funding pool for that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's something that I think everybody struggles with. I mean, we've all got different invasive species, but yeah, they're there and we've got tons of them.
Yeah. Invasive species is one of those that seems like you get rid of one, another one comes in. Here in the central part of the state, the big one is, like I said, bush honeysuckle. That's just one that you have to constantly keep at. It's going to be here, but you can manage it and help get your forest to a level that it won't get rid of entirely, but it'll keep it suppressed where you can still get good other tree growth as opposed to just invasive honeysuckle. Some of the cost share that's provided on that is there's a cut stump practice that essentially it just like it says, you cut the stem off and apply herbicide to that stem as the first treatment. And there's some follow-up treatments as well to capture any kind of new growth that may come. Once you get the initial parent plant out of the way, then you might have some new growth from seeds that were previously left. So there is cost share to kind of help you keep that at bay. And then as you go more in eastern Kentucky, you're dealing with tree of heaven, ailanthus, and then there's princess tree. Then you got some privet coming in. A lot of ones you see is the calorie pear. That one's kind of starting to get out of control a little bit, and some of the burning bush. Those can all tend to spread pretty prevalent on properties if you don't get them under control pretty quick. But yeah, even kudzu. Kudzu's one that there's cost share available to try to keep that at bay. That's another one you have to just kind of stay on it. And once you start getting it where it starts going back a little bit, you need to keep on it. Don't let it get another foothold and take off on you again because it grows really fast. But yeah, there's plenty of cost share for invasive work through these programs, and that the invasive practices are available in pretty much all the fund pools in one phase or another. So that's just not specific to one fund pool.
That's good, because I mean, I know like on our property, we've got tree of heaven, we've got bush honeysuckle, we've got all of the olives, we've got stilt grass, we've got beefsteak plant. I mean, yeah, we've got princess tree, we've got, you name it, we've got it pretty much. I've started to find winter creeper in some of the woods, and it's like, oh my gosh, we don't need another one.
Oh yeah, I've always, when I'm talking with landowners and ask them if they got invasive issues, and they tell me no, then I always say, well, you've not walked your entire property yet. So there's an invasive. Everybody's got an invasive. It may not be to the extent that it's really noticeable, but invasives are across the state in some shape, form, or another.
Yeah. And not just across the state. I mean, they're all over the country. Yeah. So that's why when you mentioned that, because that's not one that I'd heard before, I was like, oh, we've got to talk about that, because I know that's going to apply to so many of us.
Yeah. Every state is going to have some form or another of a practice that is going to address invasive species, because invasive species are just like their label. They're invasive and they outcompete your native species. And Once those native species are out competed, it's hard to get them back in the populations that they once were when you constantly got invasives just fighting them for nutrients or shading them out, depending on what the plan is. So, yeah, every state has some kind of invasive control practice that landowners can implement for cost share.
Okay. So is that cost share just on like the chemicals, or do the NRS teams come out and help take care of the invasive species and manage, or how does that work?
So the way the cost shares are figured up, they're based on acreage base. Well, it depends on practice, but most of them are based on acreage base. And that is based on the cost of the herbicide and what they think it would take if you hired somebody to do the work. Now, landowners are more than welcome to do it themselves, and that's a lot of landowners do it themselves. But that cost share is figured up so that if you need to hire a contractor, the cost share will help cover some of that. They're set up to cover about 75% of the cost, is the way they're structured. Some practices, it covers more than 75%. Some practices, you're right at 75%. It just depends. A lot of it just depends on if you do it yourself or if you hire somebody. But that's the way a lot of those cost shares are set up. And the cost shares are set up based on regions. So states get together. I may mess up here, but I think Kentucky, both Virginias, Tennessee, and North Carolina were in a region together. So some folks from NRCS in each one of those states get together and they kind of determine what the cost share should be for that year, depending on how much herbicides went up or fuel prices, depending on the practice, and to make sure that they're trying to stay at that 75% cost share rate.
And you had mentioned timber stand improvements.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and any other forest related programs that there might be available?
Yeah, so one of the big ones we do, especially in the southeast area, is the forest stand improvement. And the main objective behind that is you're going in and you're taking out either mid-story or canopy trees that are undesired. In our state, a lot of our forests are oak hickory dominated, and that's what we want to keep them at. If you go into a lot of the woods now, they're maple and beech dominated in the understory. So the key component behind the FSI is you want to try to take out some of those undesirable trees in the mid-story so that you have your next generation of oak hickory coming up. So in the case that you might have a natural disaster, a tornado, for example, come through and it takes the canopy oak out, you've got replacement there. It's just not going to be that maple beech midstory that's now going to take over your canopy. That's what you're trying to avoid with some of those practices. Or if you decide to come through and do a timber harvest, you've got that next generation to come up. You're staging it for the next growth. And that's kind of the idea and the focus behind some of the forest stand improvement practices. Another element you're trying to do is you're trying to get some of the herbaceous growth in the understory developed. If you go into a forest and you can see for 100 yards all the way through the understory, that's great for a park setting, but for wildlife, that's not ideal. They need that herbaceous growth in softmass, greenbrier, blueberry. Just for example, some of the soft masses that a lot of the wildlife species feed upon. Deer browse on them. You got turkey coming through, grouse especially. They need those soft mass species in order to build their populations and survive. So that's another element that we look at on the wildlife side of it. Now, and again, NRCS also works with Kentucky Division of Forestry. For somebody that might be timber management minded, it's going to be a little bit different as opposed to a wildlife side, because again, you're trying to manipulate light so that it creates either understory growth or more crown development. So, there's two agencies there that landowners can work with depending on what their goals are. Again, it comes down to what's the landowner's goals. If they want timber management, then they can consult with foresters. If they're more wildlife management, then they can consult with Kentucky Division of Fish and Wildlife, and we can help them write on management plans for that. So, and that's kind of the big thing is you're just trying to get that understory growth, which is lacking, as well as you trying to get the next oak hickory generation coming along so that you maintain a good, healthy forest, especially here in eastern Kentucky. Some of the other practices that go along with that are patch clear cuts. Situations that you might have in there is maybe you are ready for a harvest. And so sometimes the best thing you can do, especially for oak and hickory, is just to go through there and do a clear cut and let it all come back at once. That's great. Sometimes great for the forest, and sometimes great. It's really great for the wildlife. They love that early successional habitat. But you might also have stands that are just dominated with undesirable trees that is suppressing a lot of the more desirable trees. So in those cases, it's good just to cut it down and let it start over. And then another situation that we run into is some landowners have had a timber harvest done in the past, and they've gone through and what's called high graded, essentially taking all the best and left the undesirable stuff. So again, in those cases, you might be better off just to go ahead and cut that down, let it all come back at once. If you're wildlife minded, you can't ask for better habitat than early successional habitat. It provides bedding and foraging area for deer. It provides cover for turkey. Excellent grouse habitat. A lot of songbirds like it. Migratory birds. It's just not. It comes across as if you're only hunting minded, but if you're a bird watcher, I encourage you to go to a spot where a clear cut is taking place and just notice all the migratory birds that come into those areas because they're just enriched with wildlife. Some of the other practices that we do that are forest minded are edge feathering. Essentially, edge feathering is the concept where you have a hard edge of an open field meeting a forest edge. The idea behind this is you're trying to create a soft edge where you develop kind of 3 stages of habitat before you reach the mature forest, so to speak. And this process, the first 10 or 15 feet into that forest edge from the field, you essentially clear cut it. And then the next 20 feet, you take out 50% of the mid-story, and then the next 20 feet, you take out about 30%. And you're just creating 3 levels of habitat before you reach the mature forest. And this is, especially if you're interested in quail, that's a great practice for quail because they need that shrubby component on the field edges to survive. It's great for rabbits. It's great for deer. A lot of things use field edges. If you ever go to a field where you can see some kind of manipulation that's taking place, some kind of disturbance on that field edge, I mean, you can just notice the wildlife activity that has occurred within those edges. I mean, wildlife love field edges or just edges in general. So those some of the I guess main practices we do in Eastern Kentucky that are forest related.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like you said, everything loves the edges because you've got that gradient, you've got that mixture of different habitats that things can use.
Oh yeah.
So here in the Eastern U.S., water is not an issue for most of us. I mean, there's streams, there's creeks, there's ponds, there's rivers. I mean, you name it, we've got it. And I mean, even wetlands like swamps and other areas. Are there different practices for working with some of those? Because again, here in the Eastern U.S., many of those have been moved or drained over the years, and there's erosion issues. I mean, I know with our stream that flows through our property, it is deeply entrenched in its banks. Are there things that can help with those situations?
Yeah, there is. I'll kind of take this in a couple of stages. There is an easement program that's offered through NRCS. It's the Wetland Reserve Easement. And what it tries to do is it tries to take areas that were once wetlands and maybe have been tiled to drain them off to be farmed. And now maybe that landowner has decided they don't want to farm anymore. They want to convert it back to a wetland, or somebody else has bought the property and they want to convert it back to a wetland. So if it's wet soils, it's eligible for that program. And essentially it's an easement. You're signing an easement, a lifetime easement, in which NRCS will pay you for that property. You still own the property, but you're essentially kind of giving up most of your management rights for that property as to convert it back to a wetland. That one is really popular in Western Kentucky and a lot of the Western states as well, where you've had a lot of areas that's been drained for crops. and folks are wanting to convert those back to wetlands. It pays pretty good. It pays about 95% of what the actual land value is. And really the reason it doesn't pay 100% is because you still own it. So you can still, use it for hunting. You can still use it for recreational activities in a sense. You can't cut a bunch of ATV trails through it and stuff like that, but you can use it for walking and things like that. But it's a really popular program. We've done some here in Eastern Kentucky, but like I said, it's more popular out in Western Kentucky, just because you have a lot more wet soils out there. But yeah, that's one that purposely seeks to convert areas back to wetlands. And if you're somebody that wants to see that done, and you're done farming, or you've bought a piece of property that has been farmed, but you want to see it converted back to a wetland, that's probably one of the better practices out there, because you can rest assured that it's going to be protected. It's not going to be drained again. And then as far as we help a lot with farmers that maybe have cattle getting into streams or cattle getting into their ponds. We can offer exclusion fences to keep them out of the stream. And with that, we can provide cost share to do livestock pipelines and tanks so that they get city water as opposed to the creek water. Because even though it looks fresh, there's a lot of contaminants in some of our streams and stuff. And, it's been shown that when cattle get good, clean water, their coats are healthier. They tend to put on more weight, and it's just better all around for the animal. So we can fence off, ponds and streams to protect water quality, to keep them out of there. And then, like I said, provide water facilities for them. And that goes for about any kind of water body in the state. Now, the sizes of certain streams classes, 1 through 5, 5 being like a river, they might have certain parameters that a stream 1 would not have. For example, if you want to do a riparian buffer, which is essentially plant trees along a stream bank or some kind of water body. If you're on a river, your minimum distance is 100 feet that you would have to be willing to sign up for. But it's 100 feet. But if you don't own 100 feet, of course, we can work with you on that too. But yeah, those are just some of the things that are a little bit different depending on the water body, river classes. Then there's also some, if you've got bank erosion issues, if it's something that can't be fixed by just fencing livestock out and maybe letting it either grow back naturally or actually doing a planting within that buffer area, there is also cost share available to help with stream bank mitigation, so that kind of fix the stream banks to where you don't get a channelized flow, as opposed to it has more air to spread out, so you don't get that hard cut like when you get a large rainfall event. So there is cost share out there to help with water quality issues. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's also good to know, because I have a lot of people asking me about that as well. And I'm like, yeah, we're dealing with a lot of that ourselves. And it's not all stuff we can deal with on our own property, even because it runs through our property. So it's coming onto our property in some cases. I mean, we also have the stream heads, but I'm in karst land. So those stream heads are springs that are where underground rivers coming from somewhere else are running and coming out. So we get the big rainfall events. And yeah, I've seen some pretty massive erosion just on our property, sometimes in a very short amount of time, just because of how much water comes through.
Yeah. And talking about streams and things, I mean, I know here in Kentucky that there are some fund pools that are set up just to focus on watersheds. If they notice certain things going on in a watershed, for example, I know the U.S. Fish and Wildlife have a big focus on the Buck Creek area and that watershed. So, there could be fund pools set up that just focus on that watershed. And when something like that happens, again, you're not competing with the state. The people that fall within that watershed are eligible for those practices. And, you may have applied for a general equip in the past, and just because there were so many people applying for it, you just didn't rank out high enough. But if you fall within some of those focal projects, you're pretty much bound to get funded and to help with your management goals if water quality is one of your management goals.
And I'm sure like someplace in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, I'm sure they've got funding just for them, because that's such an important area. Are there other practices or programs that we should talk about?
As far as just overall practices, they might be interested for folks that are interested in doing wildlife. There's also tree planting practices that are available, whether that's shrubs or trees.
Mm-hmm.
Some folks are leery about herbicides, and I understand that. But there are some practices that, you may have a field, for example, that has a lot of milkweed in it, but it's got a lot of competition from like fescue that, in the spring, you can spray that field and try to knock back some of that fescue and increase your milkweed populations or just native populations altogether of plants. So some of those practices are available. It may be as simple as what we like to refer to as just like a spray and walk away, because the native plants are there. There's just a lot of competition from undesirable plants, and you just might need to spray it and kind of let nature take its course. So there's practices to do that. Ephemeral pools is another big one that we do. Those are kind of set up to mainly for amphibians and reptiles. They're designed where they hold water during the wet periods, the spring and the fall, but a lot of times they end up holding year round. But they're just little 1,600 to 2,000 square foot pools that are about 2 foot deep. They make excellent wildlife watering holes, is what everybody likes to call them, but they're excellent for wildlife, just to provide another water source. So we do quite a few of those, and we do shallow water areas as well, and those are acreage based. So we've done a few of those that are 2 to 3 acres in the past, and essentially you're creating a wetland on a small scale. I say small scale, but as opposed to like the WRE. But yeah, those are 2 to 3 acres. Essentially, you're just making it to where it's only about a foot all the way down to maybe 4 foot of water. It's very shallow. It provides a lot of habitat for ducks, amphibians, reptiles, aquatic plants, and just overall upland species that tend to use those water sources. So that's another practice that we do.
Yeah, that's one that I think would be really interesting too, because we've got an area that floods a lot, and I'm sure it was wet at one time.
Yeah.
Just because of what all goes on and stuff there. And we see it holding water during the big rains and stuff that could be very interesting. That's one of the things that we've actually talked about trying to figure out how to do ourselves on some of our property.
Yeah. I like doing the shallow water areas. I've done in my career, probably done a handful of them, but they're just so interesting to watch them get put in. And then once you see over time how that progresses into that little wetland, I mean, they're just really nice to look at, and you can see why an array of species would use something like that. So they're just a really neat practice. They're not, they don't suit every landscape, but when they do fit, they fit really well.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, there's just so much that uses those vernal pools. One of my first podcast episodes, we talked about vernal pools a lot in them. But there's so many different things that use them, not just the amphibians, but we're talking about dragonflies and fairy shrimps and bats foraging over them, and then the deer coming and drinking out of them. And they're so valuable in so many different ways. And then the shallow wetlands as well have a lot of those same characteristics to them. But you kind of gave us an overview real briefly at the beginning about working with the NRCS. So I'm assuming if somebody heard some of these practices and they said, "Ooh, I want to know more," or "I wonder what they have in my state," I'm assuming just go to the NRCS office or email and say, "Hey, I'm interested." Is that the first step?
Yeah. Each state has their own NRCS webpage that if you're interested, you can go there. And generally, each state has the practices that they make available. But I'm more of a person-to-person kind of communication. I know that's hard with the times right now, but a phone conversation, or some offices are letting folks in, but just contact your NRCS representative for your counties and just kind of talk to them. Tell them what you have, tell them what your goals are. If here in Kentucky, if NRCS is contacting and it's something that is agricultural related, then they tend to handle it. But if it's wildlife or forestry related, it gets sent to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife or Kentucky Division of Forestry, depending on what the landowner's goal is. So we're all here to help one another, make the best service provided for that landowner. So yeah, just go see what's offered, especially in some of these other states that I'm not too familiar with what they offer. But yeah, I mean, I would just encourage folks, if you're interested, just either call or stop in and talk to them and just see what's available.
Yeah.
Because you'd be surprised what practices are out there that would suit what you're trying to do on your property.
And what kind of a timeline are we looking at for some of these practices? Because I know you are talking about cost shares and funding and stuff like that. And if I was to come in and talk to you today, what kind of a timeline are we looking at for some of this?
So the NRCS fiscal year is October to October. So come October 1, they will actually be in the 2022 fiscal year. And so they will be starting the 2022 funding fiscal year. Again, each state can kind of set their application cutoff periods. So depending on what state you're in, I think here in Kentucky, they're looking more in November to have an application cutoff period, but it may be different in West Virginia or Virginia, just depending on your state. But yeah, if you were to come today and say, hey, this is what I want to do. Again, if you don't have your farm number, I would give you the information to go get your farm number from Farm Service Agency. But I'd have you fill out an application. We'd put together a plan, and then once the application cutoff period runs its course, then we have what's called a ranking period, and that's usually just for example, it might be till the end of January. We have to take all those applications and rank them based on what they're doing. And then we get those ranking scores, and come the end of January, that's when all those ranking scores are entered, and the state office will decide what those cutoff scores are going to be. So let's say you get funded. At that point, there's about another little waiting period where we actually put the contract together, and then we'll go over that contract with you. And if you decide everything looks, then you sign that contract. And at that point, you're entering a legal obligation to implement those practices that you're agreeing to do. Now, the time frame is going to be based on what the practices you're doing. So, for example, if you're wanting to do a clear cut for the 2022 period, the NRCS has to abide by the federal guidelines for endangered species. So one of the big things here in Eastern Kentucky is the Indiana bat and the Virginia long-eared bat. So in order to do practices where you're felling trees, you have to wait till November 16th until the end of March 30th. You get that little time frame right there, is because that's when those bat species are more than likely going to be hibernating in caves. It's kind of the way that's set up. And there's no risk for incidental take by falling a tree. So, for example, by the time you went through the contracting ranking and contracting period, you're going to miss that window for the 2021. This is where it gets confusing. The 2021 year, but the 2022
fiscal
funding. Yeah. So that practice would be, planned for maybe December of 2022. So you would have that. You're almost a year out before you could start implementing that practices. Other practices like forest improvement, that can be done depending on what types of herbicides you use. That can be done kind of year round. So if you signed your contract in May, you could essentially start doing some of those practices the day after you sign your contract, and it becomes obligated. So the time frame really depends on the practices you're doing. For pollinators example, the big thing in getting the pollinator planning established is the competition. You want to get rid of all the competition, because that is going to make your planting that much more successful.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on what kind of competition you got, you may have to spend a year doing herbicide treatments to get that competition completely eradicated. And one off the bat is Johnson grass. If you got a lot of Johnson grass, you might as well expect to spend one whole year of multiple sprayings to get that to some kind of manageable control before you need to plant your pollinators. So in that case, you may sign your contract, and typically the best time to plant those is going to be your May and June months. And then you can also plant them in a dormant season, because a lot of those forbs need to go through a dormant period before they'll start growing and germinate. So, that May, June window is a good time to plant, or, November, December, January is a good time to plant as well during the winter months. So if you sign that contract in May of next year, then you're not really going to be planting until May of 2023, just for an example, on a pollinator planting, just because you're not going to have time to get the area ready to make it a successful planting. So there is some cases where, you might be able to plant that year. If it was an old crop field, it's already had multiple herbicide treatments on it. So the competition level is already going to be really low. So that might be an instance where, hey, you can sign that in April, and then in June, you can come right in and plant it. Maybe just need to do one herbicide treatment, but it really just depends on the practice you're doing. And then some of our practices need to have engineers design them. Shallow water area, for example, that needs to be an engineered design practice. So you'd have to wait on those specs. So the time frame to implement the practices vary depending on what kind of practice you're doing.
But for the most part, you're looking at months until you know if you've got it or not.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the implementation really starts when you're getting, the spraying for a pollinator. That's part of the implementation.
Right, correct.
The getting the engineer contracts for the shallow wetlands. That's, again, that's part of the implementation. It's not the fun part, but
right.
You have to go through it.
Yep. And that's, you're talking about pollinators, if you spend that year, one whole year spraying, the way the cost share works, it's paid out once that practice has been established. So while the herbicide cost share is part of that payment altogether, as well as the seed, all that's encompassed in one payment. So you may spend a year spraying without seeing any kind of reimbursement until you actually get the seed in the ground. That's when you'll get the reimbursement, because that's figured in to that practice scenario and payment schedule. So yeah, that is kind of the non-fun part of it. You spend a year just spraying and maybe mowing a field to kind of keep it at a manageable level so that you can get that seed bed prepped and make sure you've taken all the steps to try to make that pollinator a successful planting. They're kind of finicky to begin with, the seeds and everything, they got their mind of their own sometimes, but the steps you can take to just help them is going to be a big key and make sure it becomes established.
Right. And what you just said there about the funding and the payments, I think is also important, because some of these practices aren't exactly cheap. And if you have to wait until, you may be getting a 75% cost share, but if you have to fund it out of your pocket until it's all done, then that changes things for a lot of people too.
Yeah. And I have seen instances like that. There are, let's say you get funded and there's some practices you want to implement, but you may not have the capital at the moment to buy the necessary supplies to implement that. There are some processes you can go through, forgetting the term, but essentially you get the cost share up front to implement that practice. Now, by doing that, you're agreeing that you will have the practice installed within 3 months. So it's good in the sense that, you're going to get the cost share up front to buy the supplies, but at the same time, you've got a short time window to get that in. Whereas, you may have a practice, you've got a year to get that practice established. The way NRCS works is when you sign that contract, you've got 1 year to complete a practice. You may have multiple practices on your contract spread out over multiple years, but you need to have one done within the first 12 months of signing the contract. That's just one of their stipulations that come with signing that contract. It don't have to be a big practice. It can be anything from spraying a half-acre field and just letting it go. That's one practice that you've got your cost share on. And the contracts are set up to where they're spaced out over years and they're planned in months that best fit the scenario for that practice. So, for example, we keep going back to the pollinator, but that's going to be planned in a month to where you can actually plant it. It's not going to be planned in April or March or something to where it's not going to be that successful, but it's going to be planned in a time frame that, once you get it planted, that is the time frame you can plant it and get your cost share.
Okay.
And that's how a lot of these practices are set up, different months throughout the year and spaced out over different years, depending on how big your contract is.
Okay, that's good. Because yeah, I was just thinking on some of these larger practices, I mean, that's a big chunk of money. But
Yeah.
if you can space it to where, okay, I know going to the wetlands one, I mean, if you're working with engineers, that sounds expensive to me. Not having prices, just that sounds like it's got the potential to be expensive for that. So you start that. I mean, when you're going to be working with the engineer, so you could start and work with them to get the money to help pay for that up front. But you don't get it at the very beginning when you first say, okay, sign the contract. You get it closer to when you would be working with the engineers, correct?
Yeah, and a good thing, NRCS has their own engineers.
Oh.
So they would actually come out and do the designs for you. So that's one less payment you have to worry about there, because depending on the state, they may have a bunch or they may have a few engineers. So you might be on a little bit of a waiting timetable there. But yeah, NRCS has their own engineers to help design some for these practices. There's quite a few practices that require engineer designs. So that is one service they would provide for you. And then also they can provide technical guidance as well. Maybe you're not in a contract, but you can still get that technical assistance from the engineer. You may not get a full-on design, but you can get some guidance on, maybe you want to build a pond or something like that, but you don't want to go through the steps of trying to get the cost share to do that. And they can help you with the technical guidance on that. But yeah, you still got, unless somebody owns their own, dozer, for example, you're still going to have the hourly rate to have somebody do the dozer work, which around here it's not very cheap. So yeah, that can add up pretty quick. But yeah, knowing that, there is, I believe it's called a hardship waiver, that you can sign up for that. Now there is some, stipulations you must fall under in order to get that hardship waiver, but that is an avenue that some folks can try to go if they don't have the capital or are worried about the expense. They can get some of that upfront cost to help cover that expense until the practice gets completed. So yeah, there are ways that NRCS can work with those landowners to make sure that they are able to get those practices implemented.
That's good to know. Thanks for sharing that with us. Is there anything else that we should know about it that you want to share with us before we wrap up?
We've covered a wide range of topics, but coming from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife side, if you're in Kentucky, I just encourage, if you got questions or you've got property that you are thinking about management or just want some technical guidance, reach out to Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. And it's really easy. Just go to the Fish and Wildlife page, and there is a tab at the top that says My County Contact. Just click on that, and you find your county, and it'll bring up everybody within the department that covers your county, all the way down from the conservation officer to the fisheries biologist. We're all right there to provide technical guidance to landowners depending on what you may need. And that goes for, all other states. All other states have their wildlife divisions and forestry divisions. Reach out to them, get as many opinions on your property as you can possibly get, and then try to mirror those all together. If I go meet with a landowner that's got 100 acres of forest, I'm going to talk to them about what I see, how they can improve it, especially if they got wildlife goals. But if I notice they got some pretty good timber, I'm going to direct them to Kentucky Division of Forestry as well and say, hey, you need to get a forester out here and get their opinion as well. All these agencies are set up to provide assistance to the landowner. Just because we got that government label, don't be scared to reach out and ask questions, because that's what we're here for, is to help.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll have links in the show notes for the main NRCS website. And you sent several other links that I will also include as well in there for those that want to learn a little bit more. But yeah, thanks again, Randall, for talking with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
I appreciate Randall taking time to talk with us and to tell us about some of the NRCS programs. I already knew about some of the programs that he shared with us, but there were others that I wasn't aware of and that I want to look into more for my own property. Regardless of how much land we have, most of us want to create better pollinator or wildlife habitat on at least part of our property. And the NRCS cost share programs have the potential to be a valuable tool in creating that habitat. Now, just like any tool, it's not going to be right for everyone or every situation. But in many cases, I think it is a resource worth looking into so that you can decide if it is one that you want to use or not. If you are interested in learning more about any of the NRCS programs, then I recommend talking to your local NRCS agent or NRCS Liaison if your state is like Kentucky. I found that route to be much more helpful than trying to look things up on the NRCS website. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask you to please tell someone else about this podcast. Word of mouth is really the fastest way for a podcast to grow, so your help in letting others know about the Backyard Ecology Podcast is greatly appreciated. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.